Thank you to all of you for spending your evenings with me. I wanted to share with you today some of the recent research on emotion, but particularly in regard to a specific scene, which Egyptologists generally refer to as the smiting scene. This scene was perhaps the most enduring ancient Egyptian motif that we have. For over 3,000 years, kings had themselves depicted this way. So you can see just two examples of the motif kind of on either end of the chronological spectrum here. On the left, you have the Narmer palette, which is one of the most important monuments we have from ancient Egypt. And this dates to the time of the first unification, so around 3000 BC, and depicts the king Narmer, who is one of the founders of ancient Egypt. This is the earliest example we have of a smiting scene in what became its conventional format. So the Pharaoh, Narmer himself, right here, striding forward, grasping the enemy by the hair with one arm, and then having the weapon raised overhead with the other. Then on the right, you can see one of the latest examples we have of the smiting motif, which features the Roman Emperor Trajan. And this is from the Temple of Esna. So developments and variations to the scene did occur over time, and some of those are visible here. So on the right, you have this kind of big group of enemies rather than just one. You have the king's lion attacking them as well, and a god standing before the king in this case as well too. But overall, the essential elements of the scene, including the position of the pharaoh, the fact that there's the enemies being grasped, and the raised weapon, all of that remain the same for thousands of years. Because of its striking uniformity and prevalence, which you can also kind of get a sense of here, Egyptologists have often tended to describe the smiting scene in relatively quotidian and even really condescending terms. So for example, in the publication of the battle reliefs of King Seti I at Karnak, the authors note that it is only timely changes to the toponyms or place names below Seti I's smiting that redeems these smiting scenes, one of which you're seeing here, from, quote, utter banality, end quote. As Egyptologists, we've tended to focus on the motif's significance to Egyptian culture, its connections to the Egyptian belief system, and the pieces of history that can sometimes be gleaned from it, all of which are certainly important. But we haven't dug very far into the composition of the scene itself. We simply describe it as depicting the king about to smite one or more enemies with the weapon that he has raised overhead. But is this really all that the scene shows? Do our cursory depictions of it actually capture what the Egyptian artists were portraying? So this evening, I just want to share with you some of my research that aims to answer these questions and more closely consider the elements of the scene and what they visualize. To do this, I'll use several late New Kingdom smiting scenes. During this period, smiting scenes became more elaborate and verbose, and the text of these scenes sheds light on the imagery and what it is depicting. So for this reason, my arguments here are presently limited to the late New Kingdom, but I do think that it is quite likely they apply to earlier and later periods as well in a number of ways, and I'll return to that point at the end. The texts demonstrate that smiting scenes were highly emotive, and the smiting image vividly visualized the feelings of the pharaoh and the foreigners. Now, these feelings were not depicted in ways that we might expect, such as through the use of facial expressions. In fact, recent research has shown that cultures express and represent emotions in unique ways. So while today many of us consider the face to be paramount for the depiction of emotion, this is not the case for ancient Egypt. Therefore, the faces of the subjects of the smiting scene are expressionless, but as I will show, this does not mean that the image is devoid of emotion. Instead, the relevant emotions were visualized through the composition and the figure's gestures. The king's position depicts his rage, bravery, and dreadfulness, while the foreigners are represented experiencing fear and pain. Moreover, these smiting scenes were intended to elicit particular emotional responses from the viewers, which included both gods and humans, since the scenes were carved onto exterior temple walls. Once again, texts help us recognize this, and in the second half of my talk, I'll discuss the human and divine reception to these scenes and the implications of that. Overall, by investigating what the smiting scene represents more closely, I believe that we can better understand why it was so enduring. But before getting into the visual elements and emotions of the smiting scene, let me just give you a little more background on the scene's meanings and functions as Egyptologists currently understand them. So as I mentioned already, the scene was widely employed throughout pharaonic history. Kings regularly had themselves depicted in this fashion. And I do mean kings. The imagery was largely limited to the pharaoh. Now, there are a few very rare exceptions to this. Around the time of the Amarna period in the 18th dynasty, certain queens were depicted smiting or subjugating female enemies. So this is just one example of this. It's two teletop blocks that probably originally came from the city of Amarna and depicted on, you have the royal barge here and this kiosk, and depicted as like decoration of the kiosk, you have an image of Queen Nefertiti smiting a female enemy there. But private individuals were never depicted smiting. The scene was limited to royalty, and in nearly all examples, the king himself. The smiting scene was portrayed on many different types of objects and structures, and this ranges from small scale to monumental. So you just have kind of a variety of things here. You have this scarab where you can see a smiting scene, and we often have smiting scenes on scarabs. This is a private votive stela that features a smiting scene over on the right. And then up to the left, you have this item of jewelry, a pectoral that the princess would have worn. And we see here the reigning pharaoh of the time depicted smiting on either side. Beginning in the Old Kingdom, the scene was common on temple walls as well. So in the Old Kingdom, we regularly find it featured on the walls of the king's pyramid temple, which is the structure adjacent to the king's pyramid in which his cult was performed. But much, much better preserved smiting scenes date to New Kingdom temples and beyond that. During these time periods, the smiting scene was usually placed on exterior temple walls, particularly on the fronts of pylons, which function as these monumental gates into the temples. And that's what you're seeing here. Now, for a number of reasons, scholars have long recognized that the smiting scene was not historical, although historical details such as toponyms could be incorporated into it. These toponyms, which I've indicated the areas that we see them at the bottom and over to the side. So these toponyms can reference particular places with which the Egyptians were in contact, though not necessarily places that the Egyptians had subjugated, even though we see them depicted as though they had been subjugated. Some Egyptologists have suggested that the smiting scene visualized an execution ceremony or ritual that pharaohs actually performed. So this is another interpretation. And while this may be possible, the representation itself, though, the image, primarily functioned as an icon. Above all, Egyptologists consider it to be a symbol of the king's triumph. It was closely tied to the ideology of kingship. It represented the pharaoh doing one of his most fundamental duties, namely destroying his enemies and maintaining the stability of Egypt. And like all images in ancient Egypt, it was magical. By representing the king accomplishing this duty, the smiting scene guaranteed that that would continually and eternally happen. So in this way, the scene was apotropaic, which is why it was traditionally placed on pylons. It protected the sacred space of the temple within. It also proclaimed the king's potency and effectiveness to the gods and the people of Egypt, and therefore on another level, it was also propagandistic. Ultimately, the smiting scene was multivalent, and its consistency can be understood as partly a result of these various meanings and the ways in which the scene functioned in its ancient context. However, as I hope to show you for the remainder of my talk, I think there are other reasons that the Egyptians consistently depicted the pharaoh smiting in this particular fashion. I'll focus the rest of my discussion on two different sets of smiting scenes. So one set is what you see here. This is from the 19th dynasty pharaoh Seti I, depicted on the exterior of the Hypostyle Hall's north wall at the Great Temple of Karnak in modern-day Luxor. So you can see the columns of the Hypostyle Hall behind, and then this is the exterior wall, and you can see the two smiting scenes here on either side of the entranceway. Secondly, we'll be looking at the two smiting scenes of the 20th dynasty pharaoh Ramses III, and I've shown you a few pictures of these already. And you can see that they cover the front of this king's pylon on his mortuary temple at Medinat Habu. And again, we can see them on either sides of the entranceway. Now, I just will warn you, we're going to be looking at a lot of line drawings for the rest of my talk because it's just much easier to see all these details. The pictures are pretty, but you just can't see the detail in the same fashion. So I will be showing a lot of line drawings. Now, within ancient Egyptian art, imagery and text work together. They're not distinct components that we tend to kind of divide them into today. Even if we think of the study of ancient Egypt, we talk about people who study the art historians, and in contrast to philologists and people who work on texts. That's a modern way of looking at this. In ancient Egyptian art, the text is part of the overall scene, and to understand what the scene is depicting, we have to read the text as well. I like to give a parallel of contemporary comic books, where the two things, text and image, really work together, and to understand exactly what's going on, you kind of have to use both. Within all of the smiting scenes with which we're concerned, there's quite a bit of text, and we can kind of get a sense of that here. And I'll be going through and discussing a lot of this text throughout the rest of my talk. So for example, this scene is labeled on one side, you can see, smiting the chiefs of all foreign lands. The same description is repeated on the other side, but also expanded upon. So they've added and making them into non-existence. These foreigners thus symbolize, the foreigner group that we see here symbolizes all foreigners. They're not unique individuals, but this kind of enormous horde of homologous enemies. One could understand them as a single kind of entity, experiencing and feeling the same things. And I'll return to these particular captions a little bit later. Now, we also have the words of the foreigner entity over here, and I've included that over here, kind of praising the pharaoh before them. Additionally, we can see the words of the god that stands before Ramses. Now, the god was a typical addition to the smiting scene in the New Kingdom. And the identity of that depicted god can vary. So in this particular scene, we're seeing the god Ra-Harakti. However, the action of the god tends to be the same. And he hands the king in front of him this sickle sword, which the ancient name for it was the Hepesh sword. And I'll return to the meaning of that sword and this god's gesture of giving it to the king later in the talk. So the god speaks to the king, and I've highlighted the areas of his speech here. And within the speech, he kind of recounts the king's actions and the god's role in these actions. The speeches of the god explicitly describe the aggression of the warring king, as we will see. At the same time, this aggression is visualized in the king's position. He has this extremely wide stride with his back heel lifted. He's really leaning into his enemies, and then his weapon is raised high, high over his head. So the pose itself is an aggressive one. The texts tell us more about the king's aggression, and they articulate the emotions and feelings that the pharaoh is experiencing in his aggression. These include rage, bravery, and dreadfulness. Now, this is made particularly clear in a portion of the god speech that is set apart. And again, I've highlighted it here. So in this part of the speech, the god causes that the king's enemies see him in different forms, all of which are aggressive. And remember, the text has a magical quality. So again, it applies to the enemies before the king, who we're seeing here. It's not just in general, it's specific to these people. This means it's, again, just an arrow, those that he's actively smiting and not simply his enemies in general. Now, one line of this speech reads, "I cause that they see his majesty like a raging crocodile, his arms striking a corpse as he likes." Thus, rage is described as a feature of the aggression. The king, like the crocodile, is raging and striking. The next line reinforces this. "I cause that they see his majesty like an enraged lion, his claw and tooth tearing the breasts of goats." As these lines show, rage was closely associated with particular animals, including crocodiles and lions, and the belligerent king was regularly likened to them. Now, several gods within the Egyptian pantheon were also prone to aggressive raging, such as the goddess Sekhmet and the god Seth. And in smiting scenes, the king also appears in their forms. So at Karnak, Amun-Ra, who's the god depicted in this scene, he causes that the foreigners see Seti I like a blast of fire, like the manifestations of Sekhmet in her pestilence. Therefore, the king's aggressive pose visualized his rage. The smiting king is an enraged king. The king's pose also visualized his bravery and valor, an emotion that the Egyptians associated with aggression as well. So the last line here reads, "I cause that they see your majesty like a young bull, knowing the strength of his arm and being on the battlefield of valor." At Karnak, Seti I also appears to the foreigners in the form of a young bull, stout-hearted and sharp-horned, who cannot be subdued. Therefore, the aggressive pharaoh was victorious and strong, but also valorous and courageous. The figure of the smiting king is full of fear too. That is to say, he does not experience fear himself, but he has the ability to induce fear in others. Now, several scholars, including Jan Osman, Runa Njord, and Siegfried Marens, have all discussed the conception of fear in ancient Egypt. Fear is most frequently an attribute or power that one possesses. This is kind of maybe better translated as fearsomeness or dreadfulness. With this power, the possessor can produce fear in others, causing them to feel fear and its physical effects, such as trembling. But the emphasis here is on the possessor. In the smiting scene, the king clearly possesses fear, as the texts repeatedly describe. So at Karnak, Amun causes that the foreigners see the king, quote, "as a crocodile, possessor of fear in the shallows, who cannot be approached," end quote. So again, the king takes the form of a crocodile, an animal full of both rage and fearsomeness. On the west side of the wall at Karnak, the king's fearsomeness is mentioned multiple times. In this line, the king's fearsomeness is described as penetrating something. And what it's penetrating is actually lost because of the damage to the wall there. But based on parallels, it's most likely penetrating foreign lands. And in the next line, we read that Amun has put the king's fearsomeness into the foreigners' hearts. The king's fearsomeness is referenced 4 separate times in the smiting scene on the pylon's south wing at Medinet Habu, and I've kind of highlighted these throughout there. So fear was clearly very important in these reliefs. The emphasis throughout these scenes is on the king's own dreadfulness, but also the forcing of his fear into the foreigners. Therefore, while the foreigners' feelings are really not the main point, the foreigners are experiencing fear. This is explicitly described in this scene, where the "they" is referring to the foreigners and "you" is in reference to the king. So the quote here is, "They fear and they bow because of your fearsomeness. Your appearance is like Ra before them." Now, once again, we must understand the foreigners in the smiting scene as included among the king's targets, in addition to just foreigners and foreign lands more generally. So the king's fear is really entering into the bodies of this kind of foreigner entity. And again, the imagery is depicting this. Njord, Osman, and Morenz, they've all noted that the relationship between fear is very, very closely tied to the face and the eyes in Egyptian texts. So when fear was transferred from the possessor to another person, it was usually transferred through sight. It could be emitted from and enter through the eyes, and fear was often described in relation to the face. Now, when we examine the smiting scene, we can actually see this transference occurring. The Pharaoh's vision, his eyes, his face, his uraeus, they're all focused down onto the group of foreigners. At the same time, the foreigners look up at him, or at least half of them do. Those on the other side look away from the king, but they see the god, Amun-Ra here, and his words. And as we know, the words explicitly describe Amun-Ra acting as an enabler of the king, putting the king's sphere into the foreigner entity and causing the foreigners to see the king's aggression. Therefore, on both sides, the foreigners see the king, either through the king himself or through Amun-Ra and his words. The composition literally depicts the foreigners trapped, surrounded by the king's aggression, rage, and valor, but also his fearsomeness, which is entering into their bodies through their upturned faces. Now, one way that the artist may have depicted this foreigner entity feeling this fear, now that it's been transferred to them, was through possibly the frontal faces of foreigners. And you can see this more clearly here, that some of the faces are facing forward. This is, seeing a frontal face in Egyptian art, I'm sure, as you know, is highly, highly unusual. Yuri Volokhin has suggested that the occasional frontality of foreign enemies in other types of scenes express the enemy's terror and vulnerability. And it seems quite possible that Volokhin's interpretation also applies to the frontality that we see in the smiting scenes. The foreigners' positions and gestures also seem to visualize their fear. So they often raise an arm, as you can see here, to either side. And although their face is turned to the king or the god, their torso is usually turned away. So again, you can see this is their backs, but then they have the one arm raised. So it's creating this kind of twisted position in which the foreigners are looking over their shoulder at the king or the god. This position could be deliberately emphasized. So in this case, we have this Nubian in the front here who's not looking towards Amun or his words. Instead, he's deliberately turned his head down and away, but in doing this, he's now twisted his back towards the god. In scenes of battle, which are closely related to smiting scenes, this turn back position with the arm raised was frequently employed. And scholars such as Spallinger and Osman have described it as expressing the foreigner's fear and submission. Indeed, in the Battle of Kadesh, the captions of the Hittite king, who we're seeing here, the largest figure within the chariot, this is a photograph of him, this is that line drawing. We can see the king here in this position, and the text explicitly describe him as turning his back to Ramses II, who was standing over to his right, over here, and turning his back to Ramses II in fear, as he's depicted moving in the opposite direction. So the position is clearly one of retreat. Thus, foreigners in smiting scenes are often shown in this position of retreat. Now, on the south tower of the eastern high gate in Medinet Habu, we have another smiting scene here, and the foreigner entity is actually moving away from the king with their free arms raised here. Yet they are still clearly trapped by the figure of the god in front of them. So the foreigners in these smiting scenes are not going anywhere. Rather, the position of retreat and that raised arm was another way that artists visualize the foreigner's fear and submission. The foreigner entity is also experiencing pain. Certainly the king is yanking their bodies upright by their hair, which is obviously a very painful position. However, I believe that the gesture of a raised weapon that we see the king himself doing It may look anticipatory to us and as though it's kind of a threat for pain, but instead, I believe that it's actually a visual cue for the entire painful action itself. So as we saw in this scene, the captions describe the smiting as ongoing, and the king is actively reducing the foreigners to non-existence, indicating that these processes are already taking place in the motif. Indeed, Spollinger has argued that time was condensed and manipulated in battle scenes. And similarly, him and others have discussed the verb forms used in the god's speeches and kind of identified a sense of timelessness that they were meant to convey. Now, I would suggest that we're seeing a similar thing with the smiting scene. The anticipatory and threatening moment that we see with the king's raised arm is only part of what the artists are actually depicting. Instead, the motif is multi-temporal. It doesn't signify the before moment, but the full act of smiting. Variations and added details within smiting scenes support this reading and demonstrate ways in which artists experimented with how to express this very, very complex concept. So for example, the lowered arms of foreigners in certain scenes, such as the ones that you can see here, may signal those foreigners' death and destruction. So then this entire foreigner entity would simultaneously be in fear, submission, and final defeat and death. Sometimes artists also depicted the king's lion mauling the foreigners in the smiting scene, thus showing that the foreigner entity is actively in pain in the process of being annihilated, while also maintaining the kind of traditional pose of the king. Another variation you can see here, this is a very small stela, which seems to be a trial piece in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And we see, again, this kind of another variation. Now, both this stela and the traditional smiting scene depict the king slaughtering his enemies, but they visualize a different moment of the act. In this case, we're seeing the king's weapon, which is this kind of spear he's holding, actively penetrating the body of the foreigner. Now, the foreigner's position here is then really emphasizing his pain. The king's aggressive pose, along with the other emotions I've discussed, is still clear in this moment. So we still have him striding forward. Also, this very, very prominent uraeus kind of underlines this aggression. But since the sole foreigner is already dead or dying, there's really no way to represent the transference of fear from the king to the foreigners, nor the foreigner's feeling of fear. This may have made the king's own dreadfulness less pronounced in this particular case. The texts demonstrate that the king's fearsomeness and his ability to propel this spear into his enemies was an extremely important aspect of the belligerent king. Therefore, this stela may indicate why the Egyptians preferred to visualize the climatic moment of smiting instead. This climatic moment successfully communicated fear as well as rage, bravery, the transference of fear, and the foreigner's pain. So all of that is visible, is clear within this kind of very traditional and iconic scene. Okay, so now let's turn to the audience and their reactions to these scenes. The speech of the god who stands before the king as he smites clearly articulates the divine responses to the king's smiting. The gods rejoice and are happy as a result of the king's actions and his destruction of Egypt's enemies. So on the north wing of Medinet Habu, twice in Ra-Harakti's speech, he describes the divine rejoicing and jubilation that occurs because of the king's smiting. So first we can read, "The gods of the horizon jubilate for you," and then, "The gods who are in the sky rejoice for you." The speeches of Amun-Ra and Seti I scenes at Karnak are very, very similar. So here, again, I've indicated these comparable statements. Now, we should understand these positive emotional feelings that the god articulates as the divine response not only to the act of royal smiting, but also to the smiting scene itself. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, the image was magical, and as such, it ensured the king's ability to smite and fulfill his royal duties. Thus, seeing the image of smiting would have made the gods just as happy and pleased as the action made them, since the image actualized the action. Moreover, this divine joy is visualized on the temple walls through the god's gesture. Now, multiple scholars have discussed this khepesh sword, the sickle sword that I already mentioned, which the god is holding in all of these cases you can see here. These previous scholars have concluded that the sword is a symbol of power. We're seeing the king kind of hand this symbol of power over. Indeed, the name for the sword is a deliberate play on words. Khepesh is both the name of the weapon, but it is also a word for power, strength, and victory. As the god hands the king this sword, he is then giving him the ability to defeat his enemies. Now, as you can see here, the presentation of the sword can appear in multiple contexts and compositions, so none of these instances are smiting scenes. My focus right now is on its appearance in smiting scenes. It's possible that some of my arguments apply to other occurrences of this motif, but further study is necessary before concluding this. In regard to smiting scenes specifically, Egyptologists have debated when the khepesh sword was handed to the king in relation to the smiting, and tried to pinpoint the moment in time that it visualized. So some scholars, including Sylvia Shoska and Carola Vogel, have tended to interpret the presentation of the khepesh as the result of the king's smiting. So the god is then rewarding the king with the sword. On the other hand, according to Alan Schulman and Todd Gillen, the transfer of power symbolized in the handing of the khepesh could take place before or after the smiting, depending on each scene's context. So in other words, in some scenes, they argue the king is given the sword in order to smite, while in other scenes, he's rewarded the sword because of his smiting. Yet all of these scholars agree that when considered broadly, the presentation of the sword is temporally ambiguous and that this is deliberate. We're not really supposed to know when it's occurring. Now, I think we need to go one step further. I would suggest that the motif of handing the khepesh sword is multi-temporal, just like the overall smiting scene. As I mentioned above, the god enables the king by causing that the foreigners see and feel the king's frightfulness. Now, in the god's long speech, he also explicitly describes enabling the king in his act of smiting. So here we can see, for example, on the north wing of the first pylon at Medinat Habu, Ra-Harakti states that he causes the southern countries to come to Ramses III so that the king may slay whoever he wishes. Ra-Harakti also states that he smites for the king. He gives Ramses III the sword so that the king can destroy the 9 bows, and he slays every land for the king. We can find similar statements like this, where the god is doing all of this for the king in all of the Ramessid smiting scenes. The god is consistently enabling the king and empowering him to smite. Now, clearly this is explicit in the text, but it's also visualized in the presentation of the sword. So the god gives the king power so that he can smite. But at the same time, we've already seen that the text described the repercussions of the smiting, including the joys of the god and their kind of jubilation and celebration. So the khepesh sword can also be understood as a reward for the king after he smites. The text here is referencing different moments in time, when the image then is kind of consolidating into a single icon. So simultaneously within the imagery, the god enables the king to smite, the king smites, the gods celebrate the king smiting, and they reward him. Therefore, the gesture of handing the king the Hepes sword signifies the god giving divine power to the king, both enabling and rewarding him. But it also represents a lot more than this. It's an expression of the joy and happiness that the gods feel when the king smites. The emotions are kind of inherent to this cyclical symbolism. The god gives the king power to smite because the gods are pleased with the smiting. It kind of goes over and over and over again. The gesture itself of handing that sword is highly emotive and conveys this divine joy and satisfaction. Now, the smiting scenes are carved on New Kingdom temple walls, which means they also would have had a human audience. Since they were placed on the exterior of the pylons, they would have been visible to those that were allowed into the temple precincts, at least on ceremonial occasions. The words of the Egyptian public could not be included in the smiting scene itself because these people were just not part of the motif. So we can't look at the scene to find out what they were saying. However, in episodes associated with battle scenes, we do hear the elite's reaction to the Pharaoh's annihilation of his enemies. And since the smiting scene also represents the Pharaoh's annihilation of his enemies, just as the battle scenes do, which accompanied a scene like this, the elite's words that we find here should also apply to the smiting. Now, like the gods, these men express happiness and jubilation at the Pharaoh's victories, just as this example from the first court of Medinet Habu demonstrates. So we read, "You are Ra, rising like him. When you appear, the people live. Your arm is powerful, laying low the 9 bows. Happy is the heart of Egypt, possessing victory." From the elite perspective, which is what is preserved in this material, the Egyptian public was supposed to rejoice at the Pharaoh's supremacy and destruction of his enemies, namely the action that the smiting scene visualized, encapsulated, and manifested. As I mentioned above, the foreigners within the smiting scene are feeling pain. This is continual and eternal pain as they endure that smiting. The smiting scene is therefore a picture of pain. Now, pictures of pain can be instructive and propagandistic. An artist can use them to incite emotions in viewers, making viewers more receptive to whatever message the artists are trying to convey. This is just one example of this. Karl Enenkel has discussed how pictures of pain were used in regard to the illustrations by the so-called Petrarch master that accompanied a 16th century German edition of Petrarch's De Remediis Utriusque Fortuna. Furthermore, in her recent book, Françoise Mirguet examined how emotional responses to pain of others can affect a group's perception of its own identity, and how this process can be politicized. Now, while she was specifically concerned with early Jewish identity, and her study focused on compassion, pity, and sympathy in response to the pain of others, the positive emotional response to smiting scenes and imagery of foreigners in pain would have served the same purpose. It reinforced the collective Egyptian identity. Jubilation was likely not the only intended emotional response. The imagery and its prevalence must have also been intimidating and frightening, particularly for certain individuals, such as foreigners, prisoners, or potential rebels. And it was probably meant to be so. In this way, it was both protective and preventative. The defeat of any rebellious forces was made concrete through its depiction, but the threat of torture and annihilation also served to dissuade, both in reality and magically, any potential rebels from rebelling in the first place. The state used this imagery to elicit particular emotional responses in human viewers, including happiness and fear, which reinforced the collective Egyptian identity. Now, of course, this was an idealized identity. Certainly, there may have been other reactions to these images, but what I'm describing here is really what the state wanted people to feel. Good, law-abiding Egyptians were supposed to enjoy and celebrate the representation of the pharaoh smiting and destroying his enemies. Admitting that one felt otherwise would have marked him as a rebel and an enemy of Egypt, who the king needed to annihilate. Therefore, smiting scenes condensed an entire action, multiple moments in time, and numerous emotions into a single icon. The emotions may be less apparent to us today because they're not conveyed in ways to which we are accustomed, such as through facial expressions. But the emotions would have been recognizable to the ancient audience. The composition, poses, and gestures of the god, the king, and the enemies visualize their feelings. The god shows his joy for the actions of the rage-filled king, who instills his dreadfulness into the foreigners as they are filled with fear and pain while being annihilated. The Egyptians intended this emotive icon of annihilation and royal power to also bring happiness to the human audience. If this did not make you feel joy, then you are not a good Egyptian. In this way, the emotional responses to it serve to reinforce Egyptianness itself, according to the state's definition. The motif's ability to succinctly represent so many emotional and temporal layers in a single icon may have been one reason that it endured for as long as it did. These layers reinforced and worked together with the smiting scene's meanings and functions. So, for example, the king's emotions were closely tied to his power and served to reinforce this, just as the foreigner's fear and pain did. Therefore, the smiting scene did not simply depict the king about to execute a group of his enemies. It was not banal and bland, and the Egyptians did not mindlessly repeat it over and over. Rather, it's an ingenious artistic composition, and the Egyptian artist deliberately chose to employ it because it succinctly conveyed extremely complicated ideas, depicting different emotions and feelings and states of actions, all with just one scene. So thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you.